good afternoon again. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for the next installment of the HICI webinar series. Today we'll be doing a virtual panel set on government incentives during and after the economic crisis. My name is David Hickey, be your MC for today's discussion. We will get it right over to the exciting virtual panel. Just a few quick items of housekeeping before we get started. As you've noticed, for your convenience, everyone has been muted upon entry. However, we want to utilize this conversation to be as interactive as possible. So we'll have the Q&A function, which you can see either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on how you logged into Zoom today. Once the brief presentation is over, we'll open up the floor and have that opportunity with a very open Q&A. We still encourage questions throughout the presentation. We'll have those available as we go through. And further, we'll have some polling questions as well to really engage and be part of the conversation. The webinar session today is being recorded, and it will be available online. We'll have our website address up later on during the presentation, and as well can be found on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague, Guy. Guy.
Thanks, David, and welcome everybody this morning, this afternoon, depending on when you are. Today, we recognize that we're really still in crisis mode, and we're all rightly concerned over the health of our families and colleagues. And those of us lucky enough still to be working, we're really focusing on how we can help our clients and our own businesses survive this huge economic shock that we're all experiencing. But soon, and the timing will vary on whichever market or country that you're in, and we're seeing particularly Asia, who was impacted first, making some significant changes and getting back to work sooner than the rest of us. But really, many of our businesses will now be looking forward to, how do we place our own businesses for economic recovery. And apart from getting our people and our businesses working again, the biggest challenge that we foresee will be cash flow and access to capital. So in today's webinar, which is in a series of webinars, we're focused on what economic recovery incentives are available around Europe, but we'll also touch on some of them around the world, and how these can be unlocked to your advantage. But I'm particularly excited today as we welcome an old colleague of mine and a new colleague to HICI, Alex Ash, who has joined us at a very challenging time. Alex has over 15 years of experience working around the world, working with clients such as American Express, Apple, Baxter, Merck, that you can see some of the clients on there, but across pretty much every sector, and truly in pretty much every country and market around the world. Prior to joining HICI, he was in Deloitte on the West Coast, and before that, JLL and Cushman & Wakefield, where he and I used to work together. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alex as our expert in incentives.
What an introduction. Thank you very much, Guy, for that generous introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you and your families are safe and well. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. This is my first webinar as a member of the HICI team, and hopefully the first of many. And I'm certainly looking forward to this being a fruitful discussion on government incentives in Europe. At HICI, we are in constant daily contact with our government partners across the region and across the globe. And what we're hearing is heartening in some ways. Governments have acted swiftly and decisively to help individuals, first and foremost, and companies to navigate the crisis. The picture is literally evolving in real time. More and more stimulus packages and measures are emerging on a daily basis, designed to help with the initial crisis response, and as Guy said, increasingly with the transition to the next normal. And at Hickey, we're keeping track of this landscape via our real-time microsite, which you'll see on your screens in front of you. And I would encourage you all to go there and keep a track of these packages as they emerge. Hopefully you're going to find this session very thought-provoking and stimulating. As David said, you can ask questions anytime via Zoom. The harder the better. We like a good challenge. And we're going to start with our first polling question. So audience participation required at this point, please. So the first question is as follows. Have you or your company leveraged government incentives in the past? Simple yes or no, please.
I'm not allowed to vote. I don't know why that's the case. I think David's seen me influence the audience before.
That I have. But yeah, the polling is open, as you can see on your screen, and we'll give it another 10 seconds. All right, thank you for everyone that participated. And in incredible fashion, it is, well, it was 50-50. So 47% voted yes and 53% voted no. So pretty much split right down the middle as far as those that have experience and or the company directly. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to start with a quick incentives 101. So some of you will be grizzled, seasoned veterans of incentives, or maybe 47% of you will be. Others will be just familiarizing yourselves with the concept of incentives and the potential value and opportunities for your organizations. So here's a quick definition. So essentially, incentives are a tool utilized by communities across the world and certainly across Europe as a means of competing and courting for investment from companies. And part of the way that communities do this, and this could be national government, it could be a regional government or a city government within a country. Part of their arsenal include hard incentives. So what I mean by that is cash grants towards infrastructure or site preparation if you're going to construct a manufacturing plant. Could also be soft incentives. So this may be expedited permitting or relocation assistance. Can be one-time, could be a one-time cash grant or a one-time grant to offset utility connections. Or it could be something that's recurring in nature, like a property tax abatement or training support. Essentially, communities use these instruments as a means to spur creation in some form or another. So what I mean by that is, IP creation, job creation, and also from a financial perspective, tax receipts. From a company's perspective, even if incentives shouldn't be the core driver of a decision to invest or safeguard an investment, incentives are nonetheless, a welcome injection of funds, help improve the business case, offset upfront and ongoing expenditure, and the benefits can be very tangible to the bottom line. And in Europe, even prior to the COVID pandemic, communities offered really a wide array of incentives to existing and prospective new investors. And many of these remain in place today, but importantly, they've been replenished and supplemented, and new schemes have emerged. So let's switch gear to our next polling question. What type of activities or trigger events typically generate incentives opportunities? Number one, capital investment. Number two, job creation. Number three, training and upskilling. And finally, number 4, job retention.
All right, thank you, Alex. So the poll is open.
And I think you can vote for more than one. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Yep.
Are you planning to vote for more than one, Guy?
I've been allowed to this time for some reason.
I will give it another 10 more seconds. Thank you, everyone, for participating. So the number one choice was job creation, with a very close capital investment coming in second with 69%. Half also selected training and upskilling, and then just behind that, job retention.
Okay. Very good. No need for an incentives 101 for this this audience today. So what I think what was interesting from the audience feedback there was that safeguarding jobs or jobs retention, many of you voted for that, and I was expecting that that may actually have come as a bit more of a surprise to our audience, but maybe I'm not giving you all enough credit. That's absolutely right. Safeguarding jobs has been, and this is in a European context as well as a global context, a justification for accessing incentives. So you may have an operation in a location and you may be looking to extend your lease there, and there may be grounds for negotiating an incentives package from whatever jurisdiction you're in, simply for safeguarding. And that has come much more under the spotlight as a result of the COVID pandemic. Because governments have effectively doubled down on retention as a qualification criteria for incentives. Now, some of the other triggers we typically see for incentives, we came up in the question as well. So capital investment, many of you rightly pointed to that. From a workforce standpoint, so upskilling, new hires, training, all of those kind of things are typically eligible for incentives as well. And so at Hickey, based on our experience, you can see some of the typical rules of thumb that, that we see from all the various negotiations and facilitations that we do around the world. So quite advantageous, 31% average project offset, 5 to 20% annual capex offset, and 1 to 5% of annual labor cost offset as rules of thumb. What's also interesting is a new trigger has emerged, seemingly directly because of this crisis, and we've called this a sudden shock. And this is taking the form of relief to companies to deal with immediate liquidity and cash flow issues. And then as we think forward to what the recovery will look like, to aid in stimulating that recovery. So how have governments around the world responded to this sudden shock? The short answer is vigorously and on an unprecedented scale. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that there's an arsenal of stimulus packages that are out there and being made available. And here are some of the examples, to name but a few. So in the US, multiple phases of relief have emerged. 8.3 billion emergency relief package on March 5th. That was followed by a Families First Coronavirus Response Act and a further piece of legislation at the end of March entitled the Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act. In Japan, somewhat controversially and a bit of a headline grabber, but Japan announced a incentive scheme designed specifically to encourage companies to reshore their production from China back to Japan. And that was to the tune of $2 billion being set aside to assist. And that's geared towards companies producing high added value products in China. And a further 200 million to companies to pivot production from China to other ASEAN countries. In Singapore, as an example, we've seen a raft of measures, including a job support scheme. This is a wage subsidy, 75% of monthly wages, up to around £2,600. There's been a waiver on the foreign worker levy and other wage credit schemes and property tax exemptions geared towards commercial properties. In India, just as another example of what we're seeing emerge globally, a $23 billion support package, and that's mostly geared at the moment towards helping families and individuals. Meanwhile, in Europe, what are we seeing there? So the European Union member states, it's been clear that they're acting in an unprecedented way to prevent an economic cataclysm. So in the UK, many of you will be aware that the Bank of England and the government have issued a package totaling around £350 billion. Many of these are loans to businesses, and there's a further 20 billion worth of aid and cash grants to small businesses and to cover furloughed salaries of workers up to £2,500 a month. In Germany, the finance minister, Olaf Scholz, he described the aid package there, the largest in Europe at 750 billion euros, as a big bazooka to avert a crisis in the Eurozone's largest economy. And in Italy, multiple stimulus packages have been approved by the Italian government to the tune of 25 billion euros to support their ailing economy. And that includes financing and tax relief, 3.5 billion euros to help their health service, which has obviously been under huge pressure, and a further 10 billion euros to support families and workers, with more expected to follow. In Spain, we've seen a 200 billion stimulus package being rolled out. And I'm going to talk about some of the other packages in Spain that are being rolled out at a local level later on. In France, President Macron has promised unlimited budgetary support for companies and employees affected by the pandemic, totaling 345 billion euros to date. France always likes to safeguard its struggling, or its key industries rather, and that has been an absolute priority for them, especially the aerospace industry, which is a big employer in France. So that's been the government response thus far. Swift, decisive, and more to come. But what are we seeing and hearing from our clients? Well, many continue to respond to the crisis, not surprisingly, trying to stabilize operations, maintain continuity, prioritize customers, ensure employee safety and welfare, and address liquidity needs, cash flow issues, and so on. And this has obviously led to, amongst other things, offices which are empty, streets which are empty, as people have pivoted to working from home where they've been able to. But I think it's fair to say that the impacts have been unevenly felt across different industries and indeed individual companies. And even some have seen an uptick in demand for their products or services. Think groceries and supermarkets, major cloud providers like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and even those companies are struggling to cope with a surge in demand for their products and services. Can you imagine a another disaster happening should Netflix run out of content anytime in the near future. Some companies have established command centers, and these command centers are designed to manage the immediate response and begin the process of repositioning for recovery. Everyone wants to get back to work, get back to being, normal everyday life. But for companies, the size of the task is significant and will likely call for a major rethink and reevaluation of business and operating models. Suppliers, customers, ecosystem partners, everyone's business model and operating model is being tested to breaking point, and not all will navigate the crisis. The nature of work, workforces, workplaces is all being reimagined almost in real time, and the crisis is really acting as a catalyst. And I think moving forwards, what we're hearing and seeing and expecting is a shift in emphasis towards rebalancing, de-risking, fostering greater resilience and greater flexibility and agility. But all of this, of course, is going to require significant investment. And you think about, from a technology standpoint, accelerated adoption of automation, cloud infrastructure, cognitive computing, work from home infrastructure, all requires investment. Upskilling, retooling of workforces. Think about the implications to location footprint and real estate. Expect to see increasing adoption of dispersed or just distributed models across the enterprise, really front, middle, back office, production, R&D. But how's this going to be achieved when according to a recent survey that I saw, 74% of CFOs report they are cutting spending in response to the crisis? How will companies make these necessary investments in people, process technologies, physical assets, and infrastructure that's required to prosper in the future when some of the traditional forms of financing, like corporate bond markets, have sort of been choked? And really the pressure's on for leaders. Global, regional, business unit, functional leaders are all going to be expected to do more with less. And I think this is where incentives can play a role. It's not going to be the entire solution, of course it's not, but it's going to be part of the toolkit. And thankfully, what I'm seeing is a willingness from member states in the European Union, and indeed outside of the European Union, if we think of the UK now, responding to the task. They recognize the size of it and they're standing ready to assist companies. This has to be done within the confines of what's called state aid guidelines set by the EU. So just a quick state aid 101 for those who are less well initiated. So essentially, state aid or incentives in the European Union is the rules around that, the guidelines are set and regulated by the European Union, by the European Commission, which sets a cap on the amount of incentives, the maximum amount of incentives that any jurisdiction within the EU can offer to a company. And member states have to abide by this when they're using incentives to, in any way, to attract investment, to safeguard it, whatever it may be. And the way that this ceiling, this threshold is set is tied to economic development, with the premise being that the more well-developed your region, the less incentives the EU allows you to offer. Whereas, especially as we move more towards the east of the European Union, where areas are less well-developed, governments are allowed to offer more by way of funding to attract investors to set up, expand, or safeguard jobs. As an example, so if you're in Scotland, outside Edinburgh, the maximum amount that the government there can offer is 10%. That's the aid intensity, the maximum aid intensity. In Poland, by contrast, parts of Poland, for instance, in the north of Poland, it's 35%. In Warsaw, it's 10%. In Lithuania, it's 25%. So it really does vary quite a lot up and across the region. So while these are the theoretical ceilings, most governments do not necessarily grant companies the full entitlement, and it very much depends on what's left in the coffers, what industries are being targeted, and of course the negotiation strategy of the company that is seeking those incentives. So the European Commission has relaxed its rules around state aid, which is very, very, very good development. So they've issued what's called a temporary framework, which extends until December of this year. And the mood music suggests that it will last beyond that as well. So this is a set of new rules, guidelines, and schemes to be leveraged alongside the existing business support measures. So there are multiple types of aid within these provisions, some specifically geared towards tackling the disease, and others to address the broader impact on society and the economy. So I'd call out a couple of examples. So direct grants, up to 800,000 euros to address urgent liquidity needs. Deferral of tax payments and social security contributions. A raft of directives around loans and guarantees. So these are just some of the examples. This relaxation of state aid, though, this is where it gets a little bit trickier, is being interpreted in different ways by different member states and different regions within the European Union. And it's really, really important as you navigate this to pay heed to those regional local variations as you develop your strategy. So just to give you a couple of examples. So in Hungary, the agency there responsible for inward investment, HIPA, to great fanfare and very quickly issued a new incentive scheme to help companies there. And when I mentioned how this is being interpreted, there's an interesting nuance to this particular scheme in that what you have to prove, or one of the things you have to prove, is that you are that your company has in some way lost revenues because of the crisis, but not necessarily in Hungary. You just have to have an operation in Hungary to be eligible to this scheme. And I mentioned earlier Spain as another example. So the regional variation in how this is being applied within country is evident there. So the government of Catalonia is currently working on an incentive scheme that is geared specifically towards companies, small, medium, and large companies that are in that region, and that won't be available in other parts of Spain. So while some countries have been really quick off the mark to interpret these new guidelines and to apply them, others have been a little bit slower, unfortunately, and others have, and some have budgetary constraints. So Romania being a case in point, that Romania has seen a lot of investment in recent years, both in the manufacturing, but also in the shared services and ICT space. And they are in a holding pattern, waiting for more funds to come from the European Union. I think if we come out for a moment from the different regional variations, what do we expect to see going forward? So I think what's emerging is that the traditional strategic focus, strategic sectoral focus that countries and regions within countries had is being relaxed, right? So you think historically, some markets may have prioritized automotive, some would have prioritized data centers, some would have prioritized technology, and offered larger incentives packages towards companies in those sectors. That is being relaxed. We may even see incentives being offered in the logistics sector, not traditionally a sector that's commanded much in the way of incentives across the region, but given that it's become effectively an essential service, we're no surprise to see incentives towards logistics. Companies such as INEOS may now be considered a strategic asset with their production of hand sanitizer. So it's these kind of sectoral shifts and relaxation of sectoral requirements that I think we are seeing and going to see more of. And companies are going to be jockeying to position within this new paradigm. I think what we're also seeing and going to see more of are the aid intensity thresholds that I mentioned earlier that the European Union applies. They're going to be pushed to the limit by different countries and jurisdictions, potentially exceeded. Now, we've seen that if you're developing products designed specifically to deal with the COVID disease itself, those products are eligible to up to 100% aid intensity. But even where that's not the case, these thresholds are going to be pushed to the limit. Eligibility criteria, I mentioned the example of Hungary, where the revenues don't even need to be booked in the country for you to be eligible to this incentive award. And I think criteria are going to be relaxed in countries and regions as well, different types of instruments. And very importantly, timelines for decisions, given the liquidity crunch that companies are facing. Timelines for decision making by governments, and we all know how bureaucratic governments can be, but those are being curtailed and shortened. And I think overall, what we're going to see is a much greater flexibility than we've seen in the past. Now, as mentioned, this is...
Can I just jump in? I think was one point also worth highlighting is that whilst you say that some countries like Hungary are more relaxed, there are other ones who are taking a sort of a different approach, where if you're not tax domiciled in a particular country, and I point to Denmark doing this, then the access to incentives and financial and government support is not going to be available to that. So I think we're seeing different countries take different approaches, and I think the finance minister from France, Bruno Le Maire, said a great quote, which is, "Protection is not the same as protectionism." So I think we'll see, even within the harmonious EU, that different countries will take a very different approach on that.
Absolutely. So all of these changes, this kind of evolving picture, as I said earlier, we are keeping a close eye on and a close track of via our microsite. It's tempting to think that there's nothing else going on in the world at the current time, but there are some other major things going on, and I wouldn't want us to lose sight of Brexit as a case in point. Now, just in case we had forgotten about Brexit, Michael Barnier, the European Union's chief negotiator, popped up this week, having recovered actually from coronavirus himself, and to remind us of Brexit, when he accused the UK of running down the clock in Brexit talks. But I think there's an important point when it comes to incentives and Brexit that it's important to raise. So it's not yet clear what will happen from an incentives perspective with Brexit. There are some schools of thought that a soft Brexit will lead to a sort of maintaining the status quo as part of those trade negotiations. The European Union clearly would not want a Singapore sort of on its doorstep. There's another school of thought that a hard Brexit will indeed lead to a very aggressive incentives regime in the UK. My own perspective, for what it's worth, and you can shoot me down later in the year when this becomes evident if you like, my own perspective is going to be somewhere in the middle, and I think that regions of the UK will certainly loosen the purse strings. Borrowing costs are at an all-time low at the moment, and there's certainly a need for extra stimulus, as we've discussed. And what I envisage happening is areas of the country offering more incentives but not doing so in a way to arouse a great deal of suspicion. So let's say, for instance, that in Northern Ireland, in places such as Belfast, currently you can provide, as the government there, up to 20% of eligible project costs through incentives. That may get pushed to 25%, but it would be very surprising to see that go to 50% or something egregious like that. So really, to wrap this discussion up before we head into our final polling question and Q&A, there's a window of opportunity that has opened up for companies to capitalize as they go on this difficult journey. And there's going to be more discrete opportunities that open up along the way. Decisions are being made more quickly by governments when these opportunities do arise. And it's really important that if your company is considering incentives as a tool in your arsenal, to keep in mind or pay heed to a few very, very important points. The first of which is to prepare to act quickly. Resources from governments are going to be finite. They'll be on a first come, first served basis. So it's going to behove us all to try and make sure we're at the front of the queue. The other important point to make from a preparation perspective is that you explore all the programs, not just the ones that are at a national level, because many are available at a local level. So the European Union, national, regional, municipal level, don't miss out. Often, as an example, property-related tax abatements are available at a local level, and those can be very, very sizable. Don't overlook training. Don't overlook discretionary training and R&D programs. So there's what's written and publicized, but then there's once you start to enter into discussions with a location, there are often other measures and other instruments that are available that you can't find just by doing research. So this is really important, and there's training and R&D programs that are continue to be available that actually fall outside of the confines of state aid. Competitive leverage. So this is really important for any of our real estate folks on the phone. Before committing to any sort of lease, signing of a new lease, renegotiation, whatever that may be, before making a commitment to that, check whether there is an opportunity for incentives. It's really as a cardinal error to make if you sign a lease, because and then you'll forego all the potential incentives because the location will have realized that you've already committed to that jurisdiction. And don't forget to negotiate. So often we see that companies are operating under severe time pressures, especially at the moment. But it's easy to lose out unnecessarily during that process by agreeing to a deal too quickly. Often there's multiple rounds of negotiation before you get to that best and final offer. Don't forget to emphasize the added value. This is all about how you position your project or the safeguarding or whatever it may be. Emphasize the positive impact that it's going to have and the multiplier effects on the wider community. Okay. Be realistic. So as I said earlier, incentives, they can be lucrative. There's certainly a relaxation of the rules and directives around this at the moment, but they're only part of the solution, not the entire toolkit. And finally, I want to highlight something really, really important. This is around reputational risk and branding. So governance and confidentiality are absolutely fundamental. We've seen in recent days a sort of skirmish being played out in the full gaze of the public and the media between Richard Branson's Virgin Atlantic and the British government. That kind of thing you really, really want to avoid. And confidentiality, discretion brand and reputational risk need to be carefully managed. And although the bureaucracy and paperwork can be tedious, you need to make sure you've got full buy-in and representation from different parts of your organization, be it finance, HR, real estate, procurement. Everyone has to be singing from the same hymn sheet. The process needs to be tightly choreographed internally when it comes to communications, and also going back to that point I made earlier around branding and reputation, external communications are very, very important. And once you've completed the negotiations, it's important to have a designated responsible person who oversees the sort of administrative aspects, the monitoring and securing of those benefits. We often see companies lose out and lose track of the awards that they've received because of failure to have the proper oversight and monitoring in place after the award has been made. So that pretty much wraps it up for today, but I want to move to our final polling question. And that is as follows. So, do you feel there's an opportunity for your organization to leverage incentives in the future? Simple yes or no response, please. Guy, what's your answer going to be for this one?
Taking the polls live, and while you are voting, also want to encourage everyone, we've already received several, but questions utilizing the Q&A function that are going to be either at the bottom or the top of your Zoom screen. So thank you.
I think it might be yes. In fact, we are. So, you know, we're doing what we advise our clients. It's stupid not to.
Another 5 more seconds. So overwhelmingly, 82% of the participants voted for yes. They do feel there's an opportunity to leverage incentives in the future.
Good. I agree. So just before we go to the Q&A, what's coming up on the HICCI Incentives webinar series? There's another webinar tomorrow, which you're welcome to join. This is around leveraging incentives in the APAC region. And later on during May, we have a webinar which is around how to reposition for the next stage of the crisis as we move into recovery phase, around some of those issues I mentioned earlier: risk diversification, creating resilience, especially in your location footprint and your physical infrastructure. Don't forget that you can participate online, join the conversation through our various social media channels as well. And now to the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Guy. Thank you, Alex. This is Dave Hickey again. So we'll now open it up to full question session, and please utilize, again, that Q&A function at the bottom or the top of your Zoom session on your screen to access. The first question that came in, Alex, talking about, if the EU has loosened up ceilings and some of the rules and timings around state aid, are there any changes to the due diligence procedures before granting it that historically took months, if not years? Are you seeing some of these procedures being simplified or accelerated? I know in the last update and modernization of the rules. That was certainly a goal and a mission coming out of that, especially for those that are de minimis or, in the general block. So, but are you seeing this? Are procedures being, simplified, accelerated, and then as well, as we're in this in new era?
So thanks for the question. So the way that governments within European Union interpret the EU rules, there's a lot of scope for interpretation. So I made this point earlier, up to a certain threshold. So if you're a large company, if memory serves me correctly, and the incentives award is less than 37.5 million euros, then there's no need to notify the European Commission about that award, okay? If it's above that, then you have to go through a whole notification process, which can be laborious and time-consuming. So provided it's below that threshold, there's really no need for individual countries or regions within the country to do that. Now, when it comes to facilitating and negotiating those incentives with national governments or regional governments within a country, each goes at their own pace. Now, what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing, Hungary is a good example, but others are doing this as well, is a newfound commitment to speed up the process, right? Now, some countries are more bureaucratic than others. And in some countries, you're going to have to navigate more than one agency. And it also depends on the type of incentive that you're looking to access. So for instance, in Lithuania, they tend to have, in my experience, a very efficient process for incentives. You're dealing pretty much with one agency, Invest Lithuania, and it makes it a much speedier process. In other markets, it's much more bureaucratic and time consuming, but even in those markets, we're seeing a desire to accelerate things. And as I said, it really depends also on the type of incentive. If it's a softer incentive around, let's say, this may be less applicable at the current time, but let's say it's expanding your manufacturing site, you need permitting, it may well be that there's no expediting of that timeline for that to happen, unless you're doing something really critical related to the COVID response. So again, it depends on the type of incentive. For financial, immediate liquidity needs, countries, jurisdictions are moving very quickly at the moment. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. Another question coming in. This is good. Isn't this all too complicated to pursue incentives in Europe?
Yes, no doubt it's complicated, but companies have successfully navigated it before and will do so again. And I think that, as I said earlier, this newfound flexibility and desire to help is really permeating proceedings. And I really think, if we think bigger picture about what's going on inside organizations, the difficulties and challenges, the immediate difficulties and challenges that we're all facing, and then this repositioning, hopefully, towards recovery, the impact to business models and so on and so forth, that's going to need funding. It's going to need investment. So this is really a critical source of funding that shouldn't be overlooked as we move forward towards re-emerging from this. That's my perspective. Guy, what's your thoughts?
Well, that's why you need people like us. Now, there is definitely a simplification in many countries to get that, and I think that will continue, and it will be a very competitive environment. Is my forecast around the world, particularly those countries who want to see a V-shaped recovery rather than flattening the curve that we're seeing coming from the health side of things. I think the US will throw a lot of money in investment programs and aid to their various companies, I should say. I think the UK actually will be another of those, with Boris at the helm. Certainly, he's been a great proponent of investing in infrastructure projects, and I think we'll be re-examining which are shovel-ready projects around the world. And I think those that are able to stimulate their economies, help their businesses, and get the money moving around the economy, will be those that are most successful. Obviously, it has to be paid for, and that will be done in many different ways. But what my view is, yes, that there will be a simplification and for the foreseeable future, and greater speed, because they're going to have to.
Great, thank you. What do you see as the biggest opportunity from incentives for a business?
So if I interpret that question to mean from what type of trigger event, or where the biggest pots of money may come from, what it will be intended for, then certainly job retention, job creation, and any sort of recommitment to a location, that is going to command funding and go to the top of the pile. Obviously if you're intending to undertake a significant expansion or a significant new investment, and if there's high skill content in the jobs and in the value creation, in that respect, it's going to be no different from before the crisis. That type of initiative, that type of project will always command the biggest bucks.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I think it's just worth re-emphasizing that piece around, it doesn't always have to be a new project with expansion. A lot will come from, and we already do this on a daily basis on job retention, and most people think that that's not available, but it's already available, and it will be even more available going forward, particularly if you fall within the chosen sectors that a particular government will want to promote. And then on the regional basis, again, that will be different regions within countries, different metropolitan areas. Doesn't have to be just in a deprived area or economically challenged. I think everywhere is going to be economically challenged. So different approaches. So that's where the discretionary money which is made available through the local metropolitan authorities will come from. And so I see that as loosening up as well.
And it kind of addressed, well, it's a seriously interesting question. So how does, and you talked about this a little bit, I would imagine it's the interaction of the European Union, European Commission, and some of those rules. But how do incentives in Europe differentiate from those in the US and Asia?
Well, number one big difference is there's no European Commission or equivalent in the US to govern and incentives. So it's very much a free market in the US. States compete against one another very vigorously, and they are free within the confines of their budget and their legislation and even then they can enact new legislation depending on the project, but they're very much freer to to offer whatever they feel like they wish to offer. That is a very different picture to the one in the European Union, where, as I explained earlier, you have this concept of aid intensity, which imposes a ceiling depending on how economically developed or deprived a particular region is within the European Union. So it's a big difference in terms of the framework in which you operate. But again, to emphasize an important point, and that's why I think some people get scared off by incentives in the European Union. As long as you understand the confines, as long as you appreciate that there is this framework and that you know how to operate within it, there's absolutely significant funds to be had within the European Union. All right. And even in the US, you still have to go through a negotiation process. There's still a bureaucratic process to go through, and it can still take some time to do that.
Yeah, I think the money that's made available in the EU is actually almost double than is made available in the US, which surprises quite a lot of people. A lot of that will go on infrastructure projects, but there is still a huge amount more money. And I think from a macro point of view, we'll see not only your suggesting states competing with each other in the US, that's for sure, but we'll see that on a global scale as companies and businesses reorganize themselves where to best have their people and their supply chains. We're already talking to many companies along those, not ready to make a decision, quite ready right at the moment, but they're beginning to think about that. Do we need bigger inventories than we've had before? Do we need to de-risk our portfolios? And we'll be covering some of these things in the webinar coming up. But countries will want to either keep them or attract them. And, you know, India, who has always been very reluctant to offer incentives in many shapes and forms in the past, has already before the coronavirus started offering, particularly around the manufacturing side of things, trying to attract companies looking at China plus one strategies. Obviously, you talked about Japan. So I think we'll see a lot of that right around the world.
Great, thank you very much. Well, final question is, can I get a copy of the presentation? And as a note at the outset, we are recording this virtual panel session today, and so we will have it available online. Find it on our website, hickey.com, as well as on our YouTube channel for Hickey and Associates. So with that, at the top of the hour, I want to thank Alex, thank you, Guy, thank you everyone for attending and interacting, engaging in today's conversation on government incentives and how they interact, utilize, leveraged during and after the economic crisis. So thank you everyone once again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's virtual panel. So with that, we'll close out and thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.